Welcome, everyone. Have a special guest today. Sarah G is with us, and he has just an amazing website. It's called greenmedinfo.com. I've been going to that website for a long time. In fact, that's where I do a lot of research on, because he just has a compilation of so much research on natural remedies. I mean, it'll just make your head spin. I think it's over 10,000 articles at least. So welcome, welcome, and thanks for being on.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Berg. I appreciate your work and you helping spreading empowering information to the world. Great job on that.
Hey, thanks. So let's talk about several things. I would like to talk about definitely garlic in relationship to, because when I did research on garlic on your site, there's just like you have a massive catalog of things, like every different angle of what it does. Um, let's first talk about garlic because it's a interesting topic. So, what's some of the benefits of garlic on our body?
Thank you. Yes, I love the topic of garlic because I love it as a culinary addition to my life. But when it comes to the research on it, in fact, last time I checked, there were 6,000 plus articles on PubMed describing its
Wow.
many benefits. So over the past decade, I've done some indexing of the research, and we have about 500 conditions that have been studied indicating that it could benefit them across 100 plus distinct pharmacological actions, like cardiovascular protection, antioxidant, hypotensive, all these great ways of expressing the benefits. So for me, I've always been just marveling at how in the past spices and herbs were worth their weight in gold at times. And now I know why, because the research is so clearly showing that, they do provide really solid evidence-based alternatives to many of the conventional approaches that are absolutely life-saving within a certain context. But I prefer culinary medicine where it's preventive, small, delicious doses daily. And then you hopefully don't need some kind of heroic procedure down the line.
Right, right. There's very recently. I'm not sure if well, like obviously you know about. I guess it's allicin, right? Allicin is the one of the compounds.
Exactly.
Um, Now, what's interesting is there's a enzyme called SCOT. That's the short name for it. Um, but what it does is if someone develops damage to the mitochondria and they get cancer, um, allicin acts as a blocker for SCOT to feed the cancer. And as I was researching that, it was just trying to break down the chemistry, and I had to really just almost like draw it out. But um, I'm like, wow, that is the reason. That's one of the modes that it actually can address cancer is it blocks the actual fuel to the cancer cell itself. So, but it's a salvage pathway. So, in other words, you can use other compounds to block it, but there's like a back door. If the cancer needs food, it uses back door, and garlic actually has a compound that blocks that back door. So that's the most recent thing I was involved with. But go ahead, tell me some of the other things
Yeah.
that
Well,
you.
to affirm what you're saying, actually, right now we have identified 19 different cancers that garlic has been studied to, at least on an experimental level, appear to prevent and or have a therapeutic effect against. And part of it is its selective cytotoxicity. It's a very
Mm,
common thing within natural compounds for them to be able to exhibit what almost looks like a rudimentary type of intelligence. They can target the cancer stem cell, which is technically maybe one in every 1,000 to 10,000 cells in a tumor is actually capable of causing new tumor formation. So that specific cell type is so often called the sort of heart of cancer malignancy, is targeted by these compounds, and yet the healthy tissue remains intact. Whereas
wow.
a lot of conventional chemotherapy and radiation is not selective, so there's a lot of collateral damage. So that's one of the things that I find most exciting about garlic for that use.
Wow. So it doesn't mess with your normal cells. It goes after the abnormal cells. Does it basically cause the cell to commit suicide? Is that how it kills it, or what does it do?
Yes. That appears to be what is most consistent in the literature that I've looked at, which is that exactly it's inducing programmed cell death versus, let's say, a cell gets harmed through an exposure to a toxicant or an injury, it's necrotic, and then having to break down all of that cell debris can cause a lot of damage and confusion within the immune system, whereas programmed cell death is just this gentle disassembly of the cancer cell, which once was immortal, couldn't stop proliferating. And now it's like, okay, I'm being reminded I'm part of this whole body and I'm going to leave now, and then healthy tissue will replace me. And that's the beauty, again, of these sorts of natural compounds.
That's fascinating. Um, is there some importance? Is there a great importance of having it like fresh garlic versus fermented versus caps in capsules, freeze dried? Do you have any data on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of research on the differences, and I believe that interestingly, even in some cases, cooked garlic may have even higher antioxidant activity than non-cooked garlic. So there's a lot of counterintuitive dimensions to the topic, but I will say that I think just generally speaking, and this is something that Stephanie Seneff, senior researcher at MIT, she constantly is bringing to light, is that there's sort of a sulfur deficiency in the Western diet.
Mm.
And some of it has to do with soil quality, but it really has a lot to do with a lack of things like organosulfur containing garlic and then cruciferous vegetables. So it may be that in many cases of cancer, it's another example of there's a deficiency of a very basic phytocompound that we had in our diet for really literally thousands of generations, and then now it's gone, and so the body is expressing an imbalance, not so much a pre-programmed code of death within the cells, which is unfortunately the way sometimes cancer is perceived.
Interesting. So, does it have any properties like cruciferous vegetables in dismantling carcinogens like environmental pollution? I'm not sure.
Yes, I do believe that if you look at the research on sulfur-containing compounds, they are essential in helping to activate the detoxification pathways, which are the phase 1 and 2 enzyme systems. So the sulfur-containing compound helps with glucuronidation, as I recall, which helps to render fat-soluble or lipophilic toxicants water-soluble so they can be eliminated through, say, the kidneys. So there's definitely something about how these categories support our natural detoxification process.
Interesting. Yeah, and so you have a lot of also data on the cruciferous vegetables. I mean, you have tons and tons of data on that, with also cancer. It affects cancer big time. I mean, you have radishes, you have kale. I mean, there's some huge effects on killing cancer directly, right? I mean,
Yeah, it's interesting because as I explored the topic, more in depth, I discovered that it almost appears as if in the new model of understanding food, it's not just building blocks for the body machine, lipids and proteins and carbohydrates and micronutrients, nor is it just fuel for the body, but food is a form of information and literally contains within it these little packets of nanoparticles, which include exosomes actually, that contain within them microRNAs, which are non-coding RNA sequences now known to supervene and control the expression of the majority of the protein coding genes in the human genome. So technically, they're like master regulators, and they're actually found outside of us in certain foods. So now the new view of things like chronic diseases, especially heart disease and cancer, is that we may be seeing deficiencies of essential information carrying molecules from ancestral foods as being the cause of what otherwise would be conceived as, arbitrary, chaotic, genetically based causes of disease.
So this acts as an epigenetic factor, right? It's actually expressing, it actually can activate or express certain genes or suppress other genes.
Exactly, yes. Beyond the control of the protein coding genes are those factors in our lifestyle, our diet, that are also found now in foods. It's also known as nutrigenomics, where you have this information content within food that then modulates the expression of our genes. And it's kind of revolutionary because now we understand why, grandma said eat your greens and it's essential for your health. And now we can kind of understand it's more than just vitamins. There's actually a means by which we regulate the epigenetic and genetic integrity of our entire body. And that's actually based on what foods we do and do not eat.
So just for those of you that are listening that are maybe new to this topic, you have the genes, which are, they're not set in stone. I mean, they have certain programs that can turn on and off, but then you have something above that that controls that called epigenetics. That could be environment, it could be stress, it could be your attitude, your emotional attitude, and it could also be foods. And we're talking about cruciferous and garlic that have huge, obviously, epigenetic factors on turning on certain genes of your own body. So that's actually that's very, very fascinating, actually. um, when I was in practice, we would put people, instead of like when I was first starting out, I didn't really know too much about cruciferous and things because I would just put people in a detox. I would give them high potency herbs to detoxify their body, and they would always get sick for 2 weeks. They'd end up with a lung infection or mucus coming out. And so later on, I found out why that was occurring, and I just want to share that with those people that wanted to do a detox or something. You have to sometimes be careful because even powerful herbs can actually break open bacteria and viruses and release endotoxins that can go into the liver and create a blockage of the bile ducts. That's what it does. And so now you have this bile duct that's backed up, and the bile, if the bile backs up to these little ducts, it's like a detergent. It's very irritating to the liver, and that's where you get this inflammatory reaction, and you get sick. And so, what I eventually started doing is, before I start a person on a detox, I would give them purified bile salts, and the one I would use a lot would be called TUDCA, TUDCA, TUDCA. I think it's and that actually is a kind of a similar chemistry to an ancient remedy that that goes way back, which is bear bile.
Oh yeah.
And so apparently that has been used all over in Asia and Europe, but not too much in America. But if you took that, you would find that it opens up the ducts, just opens up your bile ducts, and it just allows for drainage. And so you don't get any detox reactions, any negative. And so, people online all the time they're talking about, oh, I have a disorder with pancreatitis, gallbladder problems, and that's really just because the bile has become thickened, or maybe they're trying to detox and everything kind of backs up. But if you take bile salts on an empty stomach, you can just keep that flow draining. It's such a simple remedy, but only if you know about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so many foods that I know of that have this choleritic effect when the bile gets really sticky, and that cholestasis, right?
Yeah.
It could be very basic things like curcumin from turmeric, or even garlic actually, I think, has that effect. So it's amazing, but food and these ancient remedies are still the best medicine in some cases.
Yeah, I think you're right in probably most cases. Hey, what about turmeric? I know that's a very hot topic now. What is so special about that plant?
Well, that's one of those herbs that I was just blown away by, because when I started Green Men Info in 2008 and I went down into the rabbit hole of this sea of information on PubMed. I think at the time there were 25 million citations there. I saw at the time about 8,000 studies on the benefits of turmeric, and I spent almost, almost a year indexing all the research for Agreement Info on the topic. So right now we have over 850 diseases that are indexed having been studied to potentially be benefited from this herb. And what I found was that it has such a broad range of benefits for humans that it almost indicated to me that it wasn't an accident. You know, how could one herb, right, have so many benefits for so many conditions that plague humans? And it turns out when I went deeper down the rabbit hole, like with garlic and like with turmeric, they're both part of the angiosperm flowering plant family, which now subtends 70% of the world's food production still. And it turns out, evolutionarily speaking, about 200 years ago, our ancestors started to collaborate with this superfamily of food-bearing plants. And what happened, I think, is that in order to benefit itself, it basically started producing all these compounds that protected our health and vice versa. And it is, you know, isn't it amazing? Because like you think about these fruit-bearing plants actually are giving us their seeds and giving us nutrition so we can help to disperse those. And we, in turn, get all these benefits to our own reproductive fitness and health. So it's almost like this evolution, or it's almost like a love affair written into our DNA now. That's the way, at least I look at it.
Yeah. It's a good exchange. I mean, they're exchanging all these natural anti-disease compounds, and we get to help them survive by spreading their survival around to other locations. So
Yeah,
that's actually an amazing thing. And so it's that they would actually provide this, and they just basically, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to create a compound that will help you with this, and anti-inflammatory, and to regulate your blood sugars. How about that? Then when you spread my survival, I'm like, sure.
Yeah. Well, what struck me, Dr. Berg, was there was all this research on, ovarectomy-induced models of menopause and osteoporosis in the animal model. They would basically take the ovaries out of the female animals, and they would develop full-blown osteoporosis and menopausal symptoms. But if you gave one group pomegranate or plum or orange or grape, it was as if none of those things had happened. It's as if they maintain longevity and youthfulness. And it turns out that if you look at pomegranate, for example, it's the fruiting ovary of the pomegranate plant. And if you cut it right in half, it literally looks like a mammalian ovary. I know.
It's like a little clue there. Hey, hello,
Yeah.
you know, look at the picture.
It's like a cosmic wink. And what's even crazier is that it has steroidal hormones that are practically bioidentical to testosterone, as well as, is it estrone? One of the three types of estrogen in mammals. So it literally is a form of HRT, and it functions as a replacement ovary. And then in the multicultural lore that humans have come up with over time, it's used for, regeneration, youthfulness, and it's just, sort of amazing.
Isn't that funny? I mean, you have like the walnut, right? It's kind of shaped like a brain.
Exactly.
And I think there's some properties in there for your brain.
Yes.
There's a precursor for like omega-3 fatty acids. It's ALA.
Exactly.
And then you also have like, even in the kidney bean, there's I think it's an enzyme, arginine, that detoxifies ammonia if your kidneys are
I didn't
toxic.
even know that. Wow, yeah. That's amazing. Okay, that's
the kidney bean tends to look like a kidney, doesn't it?
It does. Or flaxseed's a great example. Okay, so it's looks like an epithelial cell, which is what a good portion of our tissue is comprised of, including breast and prostate tissue. And then it has mucilaginous gel. So just like our alimentary canal and all that tissue, it produces this soothing mucus-like substance. And then it actually is the most studied of all intervention for epithelial cancers. So for prostate and breast cancer, it is just amazing how much research accumulated on it for prevention and even prevention of recurrence of these cancers. So it is very poetic that nature made it so obvious.
Yeah, it's almost like it's so obvious that sometimes people will miss it. Like, if it looks like this organ, maybe it's good for you. Now, what about the antiviral properties of garlic?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic because recently I went down the rabbit hole of trying to understand the difference between extracellular vesicles, also known as exosomes, and viral particles, because initially exosomes were described as viral-like particles, and now some really top virologists are stating they think that many viruses, because technically, even by conventional definition, they don't live outside of us anyway. They're obligate parasites and they're comprised of host tissue. But the point is that they're indistinguishable from these natural nanoparticles that our cells produce to communicate between our own body cells and then individuals within a group. So I've always been trying to figure that out. Well, why is it that in the viral infection model, you can give garlic and it has these profound like anti-Epstein-Barr virus properties and herpes effects? So I think one alternative explanation is that it increases the integrity and health of the cell. And as cells naturally degrade in their health, they actually undergo a process of either necrosis or programmed cell death. And that's sometimes called apoptotic bodies that are created. And those apoptotic bodies look like viral particles and act like them and even contain the same genetic sequences that we identify as being viral. So I know that's a very confusing answer. I'll just say that if you are trying to fight a viral infection and you use something like garlic, it has been found to be effective in various studies. So whether or not it's eliminating these viral particles or just helping your immunity or cells regain resilience, I'd probably say that would be my preferred explanation.
That's actually very interesting. I'll have to dive into that at some point too. I mean, I'm the same way. I'll start going down a rabbit hole, and the next 8 hours later, I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to get some work done. I just completely dove off the edge on something. I have to have several medical dictionaries because some of the stuff is just like so heavy data. Um, I you have all this research on your site. What I know it's like you probably have to be selective on this answer, but out of everything, out of every natural plant or remedy or whatever, what would you consider like the top of the list that would give the greatest benefit with the least amount of harmful effects? Would it be garlic? I don't know.
That's a really good question. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about raw food sources of, sort of like energizing the system because of the discovery that there are these so-called meristematic cells, which are technically immortal. They can replicate forever. In fact, they're not that different from the cells in our germline cell lines, which are, our sperm and our egg if you're a woman, which are byproducts of an infinite number of replication cycles going back to the last universal common ancestor believed to have existed around 3.4 billion years ago. That lineage has never stopped replicating. So within mortal beings, there's actually a thread of immortality. It's a paradox, but it's true. And it's very conventional biological science. So when you eat raw food, I think the benefits aren't so much from getting the enzymes, but by consuming the meristematic cells, there is a certain type of energy and information that's transferred to the body that can cause a complete regenerative cycle to be induced. So that means that you could probably just eat something raw that's from a plant, preferably organic or biodynamic, daily, and preferably with each meal. And I think that would be my primary advocacy for health and wellness. But if I were to go and search through the database of Greenman Info quickly and look at the most compelling, if you will, regenerative allies, it would be turmeric, it would be green tea, it would be resveratrol, cacao, and then probably I would add in, again, something from the cruciferous family, because those foods are so profoundly researched as being beneficial to humanity that I feel like, once you see all the research, you're like, oh, I really need to be consuming these things at least sometime during the week if I want to live a long and healthy life.
Right. You said that part of this, a word that I wasn't familiar with. What was the name of that kind of word that describes without immortal
Yeah.
cell?
Yeah. The apical or meristematic cells.
Meristematic cell.
Yeah.
What meristematic?
Meristematic, yeah, it's a type of stem cell that, if you look at, say, the cover of my book, Regenerate, I have a Romanesca cauliflower on it, that amazing fractal, And at the top of the curd, at the top of the spiral, is this little population of stem cells, which are literally transducing from what I believe is the quantum vacuum, which is a plenitude. It has near infinite amount of energy and information, a near limitless amount of biomass. So it's actually doing this 24/7, and that cell line doesn't seem to be prone to error, even though it's replicating, which is itself kind of a miracle if you think about the way we conceive of, the entropic world that supposedly biological systems are subject to. So there's a negentropy constantly going on. And that type of cell, I believe, is why there are cases in, the sort of like history around people living to way beyond like the theoretical maximum of 130 years of age, maybe 200 years or longer. And the lore around some of these individuals is that they consumed wild herbs, and, they're living by consuming energy directly from the vacuum, the sort of the quantum field. And I think that I actually cover this in my book because there's a lot of compelling research on this. So, that's a whole nother spin to things, but I do think the raw food has a certain magic and mystery to it that we can take advantage of.
You know what really sucks is that you have these cancer cells that become immortal. So here you have this cell, our cells, live to a certain point, and all of a sudden you have this darn cancer cell that, oh, you get to live forever. Okay, well, that's not fair. I mean, it's just like they lose that program, and so it's I guess it's a lower level harmonic of what you're talking about.
Well, that's a great example, because that was actually in part the inspiration behind my writing of the book Regenerate, because the largest part of the book is actually on cancer, because cancer is actually a representation of the immortality that's embedded within the human body. Yeah, only it's the shadow expression, because, for example, whenever a smoker smokes a cigarette, the epithelial lining of the arteries gets damaged. There's a recruitment of, endothelial progenitor cells and other stem cells to constantly heal that area up. So what happens over time, because even the cytokines released to cause the proliferation are similar to cancer cytokines, is that there is an exhaustion of the stem cell reserve, and at some point epigenetically, the cells lose their sense of where to go in the body. It might be like, oh, I'm a heart cell, but I'm going to go to the kidney. It starts to lose its context. So technically, the immortality and the power that is accessed by these stem cells, which is similar to what I was referring to in the plants with the meristematic cells, is a representation of the infinite immortal energy that actually we have access to, but due to preventable, often, exposures from non-native EMF and toxicants and constant psychogenic stress on our physiology, things can go awry. So, but it's a really good example that you pointed out.
tell me what your viewpoint is on this. The cancer cells, when the cells become damaged, they adapt for survival. There's obviously an ancient program that's
Yes.
tapped into, which is the cancer cell. This is just what I don't know what I found. I don't know if it's 100% true, but it's like a backup. It's a plan B to survive. And that old program was very basic,
Yes.
and it ran in a different type of fuel. Didn't need oxygen, and it just basically starts to. It's really rugged, and it loses it. It's almost like what you said. Probably back then there was not a mortality that
Yes.
wasn't programmed in there, so it was like original type um,
That's
formation.
amazing. Yeah, you're referring to a explanation, which is that cancer is a representation of the body basically taking advantage of an ancient genetic toolkit that's by default buried deep within sort of the programs of the cell. And the default state of the cell is immortality. Metazoa, or complex animal life, which again emerged around 250 million years ago, made a deal with itself, if you will, that somatic cells would perish, but the germline cell still remains immortal and is passed on, of course, through the zygote. So, but the cancer cell is a representation of the fact that when conditions in the environment become so toxic and so unnatural, ultimately that ancient program is reinvoked. And then because it ultimately will take the host down, it's obviously not suitable, but it is actually the instinct of the body to try to heal that is even behind recruiting that ancient program. So it's a way, in a way, of understanding that cancer isn't just some inexorably lethal, chaotic force out there, some boogeyman, but it's something the body does in response to conditions that are not optimal. And in fact, I like to say, we know cancer isn't caused from a lack of chemotherapy or radiation, but it is caused by a lack of certain foods containing certain information and certain compounds. So it could be cruciferous with sulforaphane, or garlic with allicin, or it could be the lack of the microRNAs needed within certain foods in order to continue to properly regulate the expression of genes. And interestingly, microRNAs are technically transcriptionally, they silence the expression of certain genes. So those are often oncogenes or cancer-associated genes that microRNAs suppress. So plant foods, berries, things like this almost universally seem to be able to silence certain cancer-related genes.
Fascinating. And so, how can people find out about you? Your website, is it, you have the main website, right?
Yeah, greenmedinfo.com. We have a free newsletter, and it's a database that's open source. So anyone can go in and search the 60,000 plus abstracts that are indexed across 10,000 health topics. So they can just type it in and hopefully get the information they need.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'll put a link down below, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely.